Hello, my name is Dr. Dennis Deere, and I'm going to take you on a journey as it relates to working with perpetrators of domestic violence. But specifically, I like to say to you, effectively working with perpetrators of domestic violence. Domestic violence impacts households all over the United States of America. And the most important thing that we want to make sure that we understand is what are we doing to actually work with this population? What are we doing to focus on helping individuals to remain violent free? At Deere Rehabilitation Services, we focus on a myriad of areas for working with perpetrators of domestic violence. As many know, we are an organization that focuses purely on working with not only offenders who are substance abusers and or perpetrators of domestic violence, but we also work from an educational standpoint with the law enforcement professionals, teaching a variety of classes for many law enforcement departments, including domestic violence, substance abuse, cultural diversity, as well as workforce ethics, sexual harassment, human behavior, stress and anger management, and work balance. But specifically, I like to talk about domestic violence. Domestic violence is something that has plagued our community for many, many years. Domestic violence is also something that we want to eradicate. And our mission here at Deere Rehabilitation Services is actually helping to keep women and children safe. And part of our mission in keeping women and children safe is to work effectively with perpetrators of domestic violence. What do we do with perpetrators of domestic violence? Well, quite frankly, many individuals believe that working with perpetrators of domestic violence doesn't do anybody any good, that the services that we provide to these individuals who are in fact men and who are in fact men who are fathers, who are in fact men who are someone's brother, who in fact are men who are someone's godfather. These are individuals that actually want to do better for themselves, but I'm gonna say something that is quite controversial. But oftentimes in my work, what I've found is that many of the men that we work with are in fact victims of domestic violence themselves. Yes, I did say it. Many of the men that we work with are in fact victims of domestic violence themselves. Why do I say that they're victims of domestic violence? It's pure and it's simple. Oftentimes, these are men who have lived in households where they have seen verbal abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and physical abuse. Many of them were abused as children. Many of them never saw any interventions take place. All they saw and all they know is what they saw their father do to their mother. So guess what? What we found is that working with this particular population, if in fact no intervention takes place, the cycle continues. Okay, the cycle actually continues of domestic violence. And so one of the reasons that I am so passionate about working with this population is to help men to understand what it is to be a man. Oftentimes they have not been taught this. And so there's a huge burden that falls on us who provide domestic violence services to these gentlemen. In fact, the burden is for us to help them to learn male socialization. Yes, I did say it, male socialization skills. What is male socialization? Well, how in fact should they respond in a relationship? How in fact, what's the difference between a healthy relationship versus an unhealthy relationship? Is there a marked difference? Yes or no? And so we actually examined this. What's the difference in choices versus consequences? Is it okay for me to hug my significant other? Is it okay for her to talk to me as a male any way she wants to? Oftentimes, men have been taught many different things as it relates to this. Many men believe that if in fact they say something that is out of line, they will be viewed and or visualized as a punk. If they show their sensitive side, then their woman will walk all over them. Men are oftentimes put into a box. What does that mean? Men are put into a box. And oftentimes if men step outside of that box, they're called many names. They're called punks, they're called wusses, they're called chumps, they're called squares, they're called sissies, just for stepping outside of that box. So men have a lot of fear that they deal with. I'm not saying that this is a bridge or a crutch to say that it's okay for them to commit acts of domestic violence. We must understand that there are three principles that causes a man to commit domestic violence, or a perpetrator of any gender to commit domestic violence. What are those three principles? Power, control, and excitement. Power, control, and excitement are actually what most of the men who commit domestic violence operate off of. They get a rush from what they do. All right, they get excitement from what they do. They get excitement from the fact that they're actually controlling someone else. They're actually putting their foot on someone else's neck. And in fact, oftentimes what happens with victims of domestic violence is they go through a process that we in the clinical world call systematic desensitization. And yes, I did say in the clinical world. Now, we must make a marked difference in understanding that domestic violence programs do not focus on the clinical. That's for clinical individuals to focus on. But what we do focus on is psychoeducational groups, which means that these are not treatment groups that we do. They are psychoeducational, in that the focus of our groups are basically to educate men on what it is to live a nonviolent lifestyle, to help them to understand what their cues are. And what's a cue? A cue is a warning sign that lets you know that you are getting ready to snap, that you're going to go off on someone. I have cues. You have cues. All of us actually have cues. Let's talk a little bit about those cues, because oftentimes in our program, what we do is teach men how to recognize these cues. It actually helps them to understand and to become more aware of their selves, of their bodies. Number one, we have what's called a physical cue. A physical cue is actually anything that goes on in your body that lets you know that you're going from 0 to 60 in 2.2 seconds. Let's talk a little bit about physical cues. Physical cues are actually sweaty palms. Some people, palms begin to sweat when they become excited. Another physical cue would be sweating. Some people get hot up under the collar. Some people get butterflies in their stomach area. Some people clench their teeth. Some people clench their fists as they're preparing or ready for battle. All right, so those will be viewed as physical cues, or a quirk, as I oftentimes like to call it. All of us have our little quirks, but they are actually warning signs that let us know that, you know, hey, if something does not happen relatively quickly, I'm going to do something that I regret. Where does these cues come from? They actually come from our primal state. We have an autonomic nervous system response, which is called fight or flight. Let me say that one more time. We have an autonomic nervous system response. All of us as human beings have this response, and it's actually called fight or flight. And the mechanics of fight or flight are very, very simple. Whenever we're confronted with a situation of conflict, there's a message that's actually sent from our autonomic nervous system to our adrenal gland, which produces a hormone called adrenaline. That adrenaline is then released into our blood system, and it actually gives us the energy that we need to either stand up and fight or run like the wind blows. How about that? We can either stand up and fight or run like the wind blows. So that's actually where cues come from. Physical cues come from. So right before we get ready to get to that place where we're going to do something, and our conscious mind, which is our consequence center, is actually cut off, we can recognize our cues. Before we begin to say something that we're going to regret, we can recognize our cues. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about that. So there's two parts of our brain. There's the conscious mind and there's the subconscious mind. Our conscious mind kind of acts as that filtration system. It is the choice and consequence center. And you're going to hear a lot about choices and consequences as we go through this particular series.